Hey guys, welcome back to the JPS Education Portal podcast. And we are here today with a good friend of mine, Alex Hayes. Alex is a coach from Sydney. He dabbles in powerlifting. He thinks he's a good powerlifter, but probably should have stuck to basketball. But that's just how things go sometimes. If you can't, jump high, you try to squat high numbers, I guess, Alex. Welcome.
Thanks, mate. I'm actually like caught between being very short in basketball and then almost too tall in powerlifting. So I'm kind of a little bit shit at both. And yeah, just trying my best. But definitely more of a coach these days than a lifter.
Well, if you're not really good at anything in particular and you're sort of just okay at everything, you should play AFL, mate.
Well, what do they say? If you can't do, teach.
And if you can't teach, teach gym.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at.
Dodgeball. Good dodgeball reference to kick things off. So we've got Alex on the podcast because this month we are talking all things strength. And I've seen Alex's strength development in his own lifting firsthand over the last, how long have I known you, Alex? 10 years?
Yeah, probably pretty close to 10 years.
2014, 2015, thereabouts, when I sort of came into the powerlifting world and tried my hand at things. But Alex also coaches a lot of really high level lifters. We are talking about one of them off air, which is Liz Craven, who has a very impressive powerlifting resume. So a lot of the best strength lifters or powerlifters, in Australia and the world go to Alex for coaching. So I think he's someone that has a lot of useful insights into how we can get stronger. So Alex, I think first we should define strength. I know that for a lot of people, that term is thrown around willy-nilly. Many people will understand what it means, but I guess how would you define strength for the purposes of this conversation?
Well, I think it comes down to what we're actually trying to measure, which is the specificity of the sport or the movement or the test that we're doing. So in a powerlifting context, strength is literally just the performance of the 1RM in the squat, bench, and deadlift, and essentially what that looks like on your total. So your strength, I guess, in a powerlifting context is what is your total?
Yep. Okay. So in a more technical sense, how do we get strong? So how do we build that total? What are the things that need to happen, the adaptations and the process of getting stronger? The process.
So
cheeky
the process, TM. Check me out, the process. There's essentially three things that we look at, or three buckets that we pull from when we're trying to improve or maximize 1RM strengths. So the first one being muscle mass. How much muscle do we have in our frame? The more muscle that we have on our frame, the greater our strength potential is. So that's obviously the training that we do for that is all of the hypertrophy stuff that we do, which obviously you'd be better off at talking about than I would. The next one is the motor recruitment or the technique, the technical aspect of the lifts. And the way that we train this is through actual practice of the main lifts themselves. Perhaps we might use constraints on the main lift, such as tempos or pauses or deliberately longer tempos to teach the movement faster or accelerate the learning. And then the final one is the CNS recruitment, is actually being able to show off that strength and that power and essentially combine those first two things to put more weight on the bar. And the way that we practice that is by actually doing the lifts heavy enough to, I guess, quote unquote, activate your nervous system and allow you to sort of show off the amount of strength that you've built through the muscle mass you have and the technique that you've developed.
I like that. That's a very good way to think of developing strength. Develop the skill, know how to perform the movements, the coordination side of things, get jacked and learn how to use all that muscle, under those heavy loads, basically. So very cool way to conceptualize that with the buckets. So in order to do those things and, draw on those three buckets, what are the key variables, I guess, that we need to prioritize in our training?
So I could come at this from a million ways. And I think that the way that we can actually develop a program to tick all three boxes is going to vary a lot depending on the person. And it's also going to vary a lot depending on the phase of training that you're in. I think year round, we're looking at developing those main two qualities all the time. Like we always want to be in touch with our technique, which kind of just means we always want to be doing some variation of the main lift all the time, because that practice is so valuable. And the more reps you can get under your belt all the time is going to be really, really valuable. How you actually sort of lay that out in the program is going to differ so much on the person themselves. So it's kind of hard for me to give generalizations or specifics there. As far as the other one that we're always trying to build is we're always trying to actually build muscle mass. Like I think something that has been done in the powerlifting world in the past is going through very specific phases of hypertrophy or trying to build specific phases of hypertrophy. But it's very difficult to do that in one or two training blocks. Like building muscle takes a really, really long time. And in my opinion, it's something that should be in the program all the time, is always pushing those accessory movements, always trying to add tissue to the frame, and not taking that stuff away when you get to the peaking phases either, because that muscle mass that we need to hold on to it to be able to actually display that strength. And then that final one, the CNS, that one just comes sort of usually closer to competition. I tend not to get my lifters to lift too heavy or too close to their maximum unless they are close to competition, because I think you can sort of really tap into those CNS things over a very short period of time, where the technique and the muscle mass, they take a lot longer to develop and maintain. So those things should kind of be in year round.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's been cool over the years to see the evolution of, I guess, the powerlifting community with their approach to programming and being a lot more hypertrophy centric in their approach to training. Because I remember when I first got into powerlifting, it was squat, bench, deadlift, maybe one or two accessories, and it was just all about, your 3x5s. Allah, are we allowed to say his name on air? I don't know.
Voldemort.
Voldemort. That was the approach. You're starting strength sort of, programming style. Whereas now there is a lot more of a hybrid, and we've, progressed our understanding of strength quite significantly to recognize that muscle mass plays a massive role. So
Yeah, I do think that there are certain circumstances where we can really go down the specialization route and really maximize lifter specialization. And that's going to be probably a pretty rare circumstance where you've got someone who's really, really elite, who's maxed out their technique just about, and they've basically maxed out their muscle mass for their weight class. So doing all that extra hypertrophy stuff isn't necessarily going to be the best use of their time. It's probably going to be better used doing the main lift more and continuing to develop the actual strength in the main lift, as opposed to spending more of your program doing the hypertrophy stuff. But for 99% of people, and probably 100% of people who are listening to this, that hypertrophy stuff has to be like almost number one in the priority list, like very, very close to the top of that priority for powerlifters.
yeah, and I don't think I met too many people who are that close to their genetic ceiling that trying to build more muscle is, a futile endeavor, and they should just focus on, near max, specific strength. And I guess we've touched on specificity a little bit, and how that sort of ties into, trying to build strength, and we need to train at heavy loads, to get that motor unit recruitment. But let's talk about specificity. I'm sure that you've probably changed your mind on this a little bit over the years, as have I. But how specific does our training need to be? Given that, it's one of the fundamental principles of training. You get what you train for. If you run 100 meters as fast as you can, you'll get better at doing that. If you throw a basketball, you get better at doing that, and so on. So how specific do we need to be for, the main lifts in the gym, squat, bench, deadlift, given that they're probably not the most technically demanding exercises or tasks, in the world?
Yeah, I think this kind of comes down to, again, where you're at in your journey. For very new lifters, you're going to get an improvement in your technique doing just about anything. And as I mentioned before, focusing more of that time on the hypertrophy stuff is going to be more beneficial for those lifters. But as you get closer and closer up that, from beginner to advanced sort of spectrum, you're going to want to bias more of your work to the main lift. But it's going to be really dependent on what the person can recover from. I think the best way to talk about this in a general sense is to compare the lifts themselves. Um, I think the deadlift is by far the one that we can get away with being the least specific on. The technique for the deadlift, unless you pull sumo hook grip and you're like ultra precise to the millimeter of your technique, you can get away with deadlifting not a whole lot of weight and not a whole lot of reps and not a whole lot of sets. Um, and then squat, we could probably get away with doing a bit more than a deadlift, but still not as much as the bench press, which seems to be the lift that responds the best to higher frequency and higher volumes. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think it's actually probably due to the fact that we can recover from doing more due to smaller range of muscles, smaller range of motion, smaller muscle groups that we're training, and less fatigue that we build in those muscles. So it's hard for me to say like how much do we have to do. It's more about like how much can you do to recover from, and that's going to vary from person to person. Like if I could use an example for two of my lifters, I coach Yanni Zhao and I coach Liz Craven, at opposite ends of the weight class spectrum. Yanni's in the 84 kilo class, Liz is in the 52 kilo class. They're actually similar in terms of experience, and they're actually similar in terms of relative strength, in terms of like competitiveness in their weight classes. The amount of heavy squatting and deadlifting that Liz does compared to the amount of heavy deadlifting and squatting that Yanni does is like, it's wild. Like Yanni will do 3 heavy sets of squats per week, 3 heavy sets of deadlifts per week, no other deadlifting other than the 3 heavy sets, and she squats very, very light on a secondary day. Whereas Liz squats and deadlifts heavy twice per week on both, and pretty much all of her sets are what I would consider heavy. So like, I guess it really depends on what the person can recover from, and also like where they sit on that spectrum.
Yeah, that just points out a couple of things, I guess, individualization in programming being one of them, which I think the powerlifting community as a whole has improved substantially. With I remember, as you would too, a la Voldemort, it was 3x5 for everyone back in the day at 85% one max, so on and so forth. But also that fatigue dynamics are probably one of the most important concepts when it comes to powerlifting. And one of my questions for you today was, what are some key concepts that most lifters need to know about in order to develop their strength? And my answer to this question was fitness fatigue dynamics. Basically understanding that fatigue governs your performance, and that really gives you so much information and understanding as to what the appropriate training dose and stimulus needs to be from session to session. And I think those 2 examples that you gave then are perfect at illustrating that. You've got one lifter who smaller range of motion, lower absolute loads, obviously a lot less fatigue, therefore is going to recover better from that and be able to get a stimulus from training hard and heavy multiple times a week. Whereas one lifter generates far more fatigue because they're lifting greater absolute loads, large range of motion, obviously more tissue that's being disrupted as well, being a heavier lifter and a bigger lifter, more muscular lifter. And that means that they're unable to do that. So I think we'll move on to that question. For me, my answer that I think all strength athletes and coaches need to know this concept, and it's fitness fatigue dynamics. And I'm always pretty shocked when I ask people about it and they're just not really sure what it all means. We all know it intuitively. We feel it when we lift. We see it when we come in and we can't lift what we did the other day. But I feel like that's one thing that coaches and athletes really need to wrap their heads around, because it gives you, there's so much power in knowing how those dynamics play out in real time as you're training and throughout your training career. So what's your answer to that question?
Well, I think it's really to do with following what you're actually seeing, or what you're the data that you're collecting in real time. It's not really actually, in my opinion, about understanding the concept. It's more about doing a sufficient amount of training for a consistent period, and then being able to measure what that has done, and then being able to understand whether you've done things well, whether you need to change, whether you need to manipulate variables. So like, I think there's actually times where we can sort of drown someone in fatigue in a further away from a competition where we're not necessarily worry too much about the top end performance. Knowing that when we pull some of that workload back, we will start to see that top end show itself. But again, this comes down to individualization. It's giving the person what you think they need, and that's what coaching is. It's really just our best guess in the moment, giving them what you think they need in the moment, being able to find a way to measure whether that's having the response that you want or not, and then figuring out using your system, because everyone's going to have different ways in which they view data, manipulate data, and then organize things to respond to that. And then figuring out then how you then change that approach. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think that it's just being able to have diagnostic tools and proxies for measuring strength is the key thing that, athletes and coaches need to be aware of, and knowing that, that's going to be influenced, differently at different phases of training, like how much, I guess, importance you place on that, such as your 1 rep max in the off season where you're doing high volumes is of far less significance than it is when you're, 4 to 6 weeks out from competition. So
Yeah.
although that measure is important, it's important at different times.
Yeah.
So
And I would actually say that during a period where you're so far out, you probably wouldn't even really look at that. Like, I think if anything, it becomes distracting because it's, oh man, my 1RM is so far down right now, or my estimated 1RM is so far down right now. That means we must be doing things wrong, like things are going in the wrong direction. But I think if you understand the individual and you understand the response that you're trying to get and what you're actually looking for, it might be like an improvement in their position under load and their ability to hit more reps of a certain load or hit more sets at a certain load or whatever it is. That may not be directly 1RM.
yeah,
And I think that's important to note is that there are periods of training where we may actually feel like we don't have as much at the top end, but that is okay because it's all part of the plan if that's the way that your planning works.
and this comes back to what you said at the very start of the podcast about those 3 buckets that contribute to strength. It's like when you're building muscle, given that muscle growth is, very much dependent on training with higher, relative to what you would train with for strength adaptations, that is, higher volumes, you're going to generate more fatigue. That fatigue will cut into your performance. It doesn't mean that your fitness isn't there, but your top end strength is going to be down because you're just not recovering the same. And therefore, during those periods where you're trying to build muscle, you're just not going to see your strength as a 1RM going up. And I think that's one thing that I've, sort of really tried to understand over the years is how you measure and what proxies and tools we use to assess hypertrophy. In the gym, that is. You can obviously, use things like a DEXA scan, MRI, ultrasound, all these kind of things. But
Thirst traps.
yeah, thirst traps, well, they're always effective. But one, I guess, variable that I, have really thought about and been using is volume load, because if you equate total set volume and your proximity to failure and your total volume load for a lift or a muscle group is going up, and you've been using the same exercises for quite a while, it's a pretty good proxy that you've built more tissue because, there's no other reason or way that you could be lifting more weight over time if that trend is consistent.
Particularly in if you're just measuring like a single joint movement, like a leg extension or a hamstring curl or something like that. If your load and your reps are going up on that, it's very likely that hypertrophy has occurred.
100%. And I think that's, extremely useful for lifters when they're, talking about building strength, is that they
Yeah.
don't get bogged down in their performance on just their top set, or, their back off sets, and just look at things in a very, narrow way, right? Like people get too fixated on, the day-to-day numbers, and they often forget to zoom out and look at, the bigger picture. And I think volume load forces you to do that because you're not just looking at your performance over one set necessarily. You're not looking at it over, one exercise, but a muscle group, for example, or, a training cycle. If your volume load, from mesocycle to mesocycle is increasing for your quads or your squat, that's a really good sign that, things are moving in the right direction, albeit your 1 rep max, might be suffering. So I think that's a really, really, cool piece to put out there.
So outside of that, like when I have a lifter who is not directly close to competition and 1RM is not something that we're sort of acutely aware of, I like to explain to them sort of the phases of training that we're in and what we're trying to do. And then what I'll often get them to do is capitalize on one of those training phases with, like, if they're training sets of 5 on squat, for instance, we might build them up to 4 sets of 5 at close to a PR load, and then we'll reload and we'll push to a single set of 5 as a like 5 rep PR. And that's kind of the carrot that we dangle at the end of the stick. That isn't directly a 1RM, but it's close enough and it scratches that itch for them. And it tells them, hey, like, if previously my best set of 5 on squats was 200 and now it's 215, like that's enough information for them to be happy with and be able to take back and go, okay, I've improved my 5RM. It's very, very, very likely that I've also improved my 1RM. So we're doing things right.
Yeah, I like that. And I have a similar approach with a top set. I like to use that as my diagnostic tool, for athletes when they're far away from competition, whether it be, with a range of say 3 to 6 reps on their squat, and trying to see that go up over the mesocycle and from meso to meso. If that's going up, that, great. We're seeing some strength gains, things moving in the right direction. If it's coupled with, volume load going up on their back offsets. Right. It's like if that's going up and your volume load's going down, that is probably not a good thing for hypertrophy. That's a good thing for strength, right? Because your strength is going up, that measure is improving. But if your volume load goes down and your strength is going up, in terms of hypertrophy, not always, but in most cases, probably not a good thing because the dose of the stimulus or the amount of exposure to high, tension reps is decreasing. So it's really important that, yes, you want to get stronger in a single set, for example. But in those hypertrophy phases that are, where you're not trying to increase your 1RM specifically, you don't want to see volume load drop off too much. It will in some cases, and that's totally fine. But on average, over time, you really need to, consider strength and performance in a single set, but also your volume load, because that's essentially, in my estimation, our best proxy as it stands if set volume and proximity to failure is controlled and relatively constant, so you can compare apples to apples at detecting whether hypertrophy is contributing to your performance improvements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it can be hard as an online coach to like always keep tabs on whether someone's pushing their accessories hard. And that's kind of a bit of a challenge for me sometimes with my clients who are very powerlifting heavy focused.
Yeah.
It can be hard for them to accelerate through these blocks that are a little bit further away from competition without sort of losing sight of the end goal. And I think an approach like that's a really good way to do it is like, let's have a look at volume load and let's try to get this fucking thing up across blocks. And let's like use this as our metric for the next 3 blocks, as opposed to, where's your 1RM trending?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're not training hard enough, your volume load's not going to go up because the stimulus isn't going to be, sufficient to elicit the adaptations. So you're not going to get those improvements. And even then,
something that I like to do is to actually treat like a secondary accessory like a belt squat's a good example. It's not a squat like with a barbell, but it's pretty much as close as we can get to that for an accessory. I like to treat that like a main lift. Like I'll give you a top set and like let's have a goal for what we're going to hit on this top set, and let's have a goal for what we're going to hit for this 3x10 or whatever. And I think that really keeps people engaged and like, powerlifters are objectively focused and they like chasing numbers. So why not instill some of that into their accessory work and see if they can push that along, knowing that we know that it's going to drive the 1RM up over time and it's going to be a big part of what does that. But it's also kind of the same way that we would motivate them to get them to push to 1RM.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I could have an entirely separate podcast with you about like lifter psychology and like how we I guess approach things to get the most out of lifters, because you're very good at that. You are someone who I think is a very good coach, and to be a good coach, it's more than just the X's and O's with programming.
That's honestly like my favorite part about coaching is like how do we get this individual in front of us to do the thing that we want without actually just telling them what we want? Like, how can we kind of use our words and our body language and like
manipulate
even writing, not manipulate them, but like even ways that we write notes in the program or ways that we cue them or ways that we give feedback is so individual, person to person. Like I'd definitely be up for a podcast on psychology,
Yeah, we can do
but
a
as long as
review.
there's a disclaimer that I'm not a psychologist.
Well, every PT and coach is a psychologist. They just,
I
haven't
just
got,
don't know.
they just don't know it. Or they do know it. They think it. That's the issue, is they think it. All right. So last couple of questions, Alex. What have you changed your mind on in the past 12 months?
Ooh, past 12 months. I wish you'd prepared me for this because I'm actually not too sure. You tell me something that you've changed your mind on, and I'll see if I can think of something.
Probably the last 12 months, I've certainly changed my mind about how much attention we give to the new trends that come and go in resistance training. The big one at the moment is training muscles at long lengths, to maximize hypertrophy. These things often a flash in the pan, and they have, very minimal impact overall on, the outcome that you're trying to pursue. But in the past, I've certainly got excited by them. When you see all the research coming through and everyone's trying it, very easy to, follow the crowd, so to speak, and to, start changing your programming style. But I've known this for many years that you shouldn't do that. But I've often, still been excited and, bit of a nerd. I want to experiment and see how things go. But I've certainly been a lot more reserved, the past 12 months in, putting too much stock into the new trends.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar to what actually just came to my mind. Is that I've actually stopped caring about what other coaches are doing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I've started focusing on my own clients and what the client data and the client information is telling me. And I think it's probably sounds simple, right?
Yeah.
Like listen to your clients, ask the right questions, get them to ask you the right questions, have that back and forth and build that rapport and that relationship and that buy-in and that trust. Um, but also just actually look at the data and listen to what's happening and use that to formulate your opinion.
Yeah.
Don't use the opinion of someone else on Instagram or some new trend that you've seen. Like I'm not sure how clued into the powerlifting world you are, but we get these quote unquote secret exercises every few months to pop up, and it's like usually these fucking Instagram lifters who are have big followings, and their coach gives them this new exercise, and they just claim that it's like the key to their increasing X lift. And like we've seen belt squats come in, and then we've seen dips come in, and then it was 45-degree hypers, and like there's always some new new
Shiny
trend or
toy.
fad that's come
Shiny
in, or
toy.
shiny toy. Yeah, and I feel like that also happens in the programming world. One thing that I'm seeing all the time. Have you heard of fatigue singles? Have you seen this approach?
Yeah, I'm off Instagram these days. Not really.
So it's like the idea that you would do a working set first, or a couple of
Yeah.
working sets first, or maybe even like four, maybe even 3 or 4 working sets first, and then you follow that up with a quote unquote fatigue single.
Right.
Um, and it's like all the fad right now in the powerlifting world, and I don't
Mhm.
like it because I always think that you should do your singles first and when you're fresh, because that's when you're going to get the most realistic indication of performance.
Relevant. Yeah,
um,
it's the most relevant data. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
yeah, and that's just an example of one of these things that's popping up, that I have in the past probably fallen for, or at least been like, oh, I want to try that and see how that goes. Whereas now it's like I have my reasoning for why I maybe don't think it's a good idea, and I'm just going to stick with my guns and continue focusing on what's actually already working and what's actually already in front of me.
Yeah, I like it. Well, mate, as I said, I think we can definitely go for round two because there's so many things that we could talk about. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I hope everyone learned a thing or two, and I'm sure they did. Alex, where can people find you for more?
Probably the best place is Instagram. So Alex Hayes underscore process. DM me on there or follow me on there if you want to see what I'm up to. It's mostly just photos of my children and my dogs, and a little bit of my not that heavy training. But yeah, that's where you'll find me.
Easy. Well, thank you, man. We will continue this at a later date. And guys, make sure you follow Alex, and we'll speak to you all next time.
Ciao.
Thanks.